Some truths do not arrive with thunder. They wait in dust, in cedar wood, in boxes nobody opens because the dead have a way of arranging silence. I was 72 when I found the letter that changed the shape of every story I had ever been told about my family, and it was waiting above my own head. My name is Lorraine Bennett. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and by the time this happened, I had spent more years in that house than I had spent anywhere else in this world. Long enough to know its groans, long enough to mistake its silences for peace, long enough to believe I knew what belonged to me. I was the second daughter, the dependable one, the one folks called when there was a funeral to plan, a bill to settle, a temper to cool, or a memory to straighten out. My older sister, Evelyn, had charm enough for 3 women. My younger brother, James, had our mother's eyes and our father's habit of disappearing. I grew up believing family was a kind of covenant, not comfort, not ease, a covenant. You stood where blood placed you. You carried what your people could not carry alone. You kept your mouth respectful, your back steady, and your disappointments folded small enough to fit in your apron pocket. That was how I was raised. My mother did not speak much about her people, and my father spoke less. What little we knew about our family came in fragments offered at kitchen tables, after church, during wakes, in the soft half-light where old women shelled peas and remembered only what could be survived. Nobody called it secrecy. Back then we called it dignity. The attic had belonged to my mother's restraint. She kept Christmas ornaments in labeled tins, quilts wrapped in muslin, church programs tied in ribbon, and one cedar trunk no one was asked to touch. After she passed, I left it there another 12 years. Grief can make a museum out of ordinary neglect if you let it. The day I opened that trunk, I was not looking for history. I was looking for my winter curtains. That is the plain truth of it. I climbed those narrow steps with a flashlight in one hand and a bad knee in the other, expecting mothballs and old fabric. I did not expect to meet the first lie. The attic smelled like dried wood and summers gone stale. Dust lifted in the beam of my flashlight like something alive, shifting slow in the air. I moved boxes aside, careful with my knees, careful with my breath, careful the way age teaches you to be. Nothing in me knew I was walking toward a rearrangement. The cedar trunk sat where it always had, low and broad beneath the back window, its brass latch gone dull with years. I remember standing over it longer than needed, not from fear exactly, more from habit. My mother had a way of making certain objects feel watched even after she was gone. Inside were folded linens, yellowed gloves, 2 hand fans from Mount Calvary Baptist, and beneath them a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon gone gray at the edges. Most were church notes, condolence cards, recipes written in limping hands. The letter that found me was different. Thick paper, cream envelope, no stamp, my mother's name written plain. It was addressed to Mrs. Ruth Bennett, though she had not been Mrs. Bennett when the letter was written. That was the first thing that stopped me. The second was the date, June 14, 1948, 7 years before she married my father. 7 years before the beginning I had been taught was the beginning. I sat right there on the attic floor and opened it with the caution some things deserve. The paper had softened with time, but held together. I recognized the handwriting before I understood why. I had seen those long, deliberate strokes before, in Bible margins, on Christmas cards, in the ledger books my grandfather kept locked in his study. The letter began without affection, no dear Ruth, no tenderness, just her name, and then a sentence that hollowed the air around me. Ruth, if Lorraine is ever told the truth, let it be when I am gone, and let it be known I did what I thought would keep this family standing. I read that first line 3 times because my own name looked wrong there, like seeing your reflection blink when you have gone still. My hands went cold in that hot attic. I did not keep reading right away. I folded the page back over my thumb and listened to the house below me breathe. I thought of my grandfather then, Samuel Carter, who wore pressed collars in summer and spoke with the gravity of a judge, though he had never held office a day in his life. In our family, his word was treated like weather, permanent, beyond appeal. He was the man in that handwriting. I knew it before I reached the signature. People say revelation arrives all at once. That was not my experience. Mine came like a slow leak in the walls, soaking through what I thought was solid. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I sat in that heat with dust on my skirt and my mother's silence opening beside me. By the time I finished the first page, I understood only this. Somebody had arranged my life before I was old enough to speak, and everybody I had loved most had agreed to call that arrangement love. That was the first injury, not the lie itself, the agreement, the careful, practiced agreement of it.
I kept reading because there are moments when the body knows before the mind agrees. My hands were trembling, but not enough to stop. The paper made a dry sound each time I turned it, and that sound stayed with me longer than the words at first. Quiet things have a way of carrying the deepest damage. My grandfather wrote that my mother had been 19 when she came home from Baltimore in the spring of 1948. She had been sent there to stay with his sister after what the family called a nervous spell. That was the phrase I had heard all my life. Ruth had a nervous spell. Ruth came back quieter. In his letter, he called it by another name. He said she returned with child. He said it plain, without shame and without softness, as if recording weather in a farmer's book. He wrote that she had made an unwise attachment to a man she could not marry and refused to name him even under pressure. That sentence settled into me like something sharp. My mother, who ironed handkerchiefs and measured flour with level fingers, who spoke of propriety the way ministers speak of grace, had once refused her father. I had never imagined her young enough to refuse anything. I had certainly never imagined her brave enough to do it alone. He wrote that she was given choices, though even then I could hear the shape of coercion in the way he described mercy. There was talk of a home in North Carolina. There was talk of sending the baby away. There was talk of preserving her future. That phrase sat there on the page, polished and cold. But she had refused those terms too, according to him. She carried me in her body and defiance in her silence. He wrote that she would not surrender the child and would not identify the father and would not allow herself to be hidden in any house meant to make shame look respectable. I stopped reading then. I had to set the letter down and rest both palms against the attic floor. The boards were warm beneath my hands, not because I was overwhelmed, not exactly. It was because the woman I had called difficult all my life was beginning to take another shape. A harder one, a lonelier one, a truer one. For years I had thought my mother's reserve was simply temperament. She was not cruel, but she rationed tenderness. Praise came rare. Affection came cleaner through duty than through touch. She fed, clothed, corrected, and protected with a precision that could feel like distance. Sitting in that attic, I began to wonder what discipline had cost her. My grandfather went on to say that by autumn, an arrangement had been reached. A man named Thomas Bennett, newly returned from military service and recently widowed in all but paperwork, agreed to marry Ruth and claim the child as his own. The wording was exact: claim the child. Not raise, not love, claim. Thomas Bennett was my father, or the man I had buried as my father 21 years earlier. He was a quiet man with broad hands and a tired kindness that often felt borrowed from somewhere else. He worked at the rail yard, polished his shoes on Saturdays, and never once in all my life called me anything but daughter. He had not been much for conversation, but he had been decent in the way decent men often are: steady, useful, emotionally guarded enough to pass for strong. He fixed screens, paid bills on time, and sat through church with the solemn patience of a man honoring terms agreed upon long before his arrival. I spent most of my adult life forgiving him for what I thought was distance. Now I had to consider another possibility. Perhaps distance had been his form of obedience. Perhaps he had entered our family not as husband first, but as solution, a respectable answer stitched over scandal and expected to hold its shape. The letter said the arrangement had served its purpose and that I had been spared the burden of illegitimacy, though whether I had also been spared my father's disposition remained, in his words, an unanswered concern. I stared at that line until the words blurred, not because of illegitimacy. That was his generation's shame, not mine. It was the other part, my father's disposition, singular, specific. Not Thomas, not the man who raised me. The other one, the unnamed man my mother protected with her silence and buried inside mine.
I sat there longer than I can rightly measure, the letter open across my lap, my mother becoming younger and stranger by the minute. It is a difficult thing to discover your parents had full lives before they were assigned to yours. Harder still to learn those lives were shaped by fear, bargaining, and choices made without mercy. I had always been told I favored my father in temperament, quiet, watchful, slow to trust. My mother said it with a kind of caution, and my grandfather said it with disapproval so polished it almost sounded like concern. Now I understood they had not been speaking of Thomas at all. They had meant someone else entirely. Memory is a disloyal thing. Once one truth shifts, all the others begin moving around it. Sitting there, I started reaching back through years I had already lived and finding old moments changed by context. My grandfather's eyes lingering too long on me, my mother interrupting certain questions before they could fully form. There had been a photograph once, tucked in my mother's vanity drawer when I was 10. A man leaning against a car in shirt sleeves, handsome in the clean, dangerous way some men wear charm like pressed linen. I had asked who he was. My mother took the picture from my hand and said, "Nobody who ever stayed." At the time, I thought she meant some cousin who moved north and never wrote back. She said it plain, then closed the drawer and sent me outside to shake tablecloths. I remember how final her voice was. Not sharp, not angry, just sealed. I never asked again, and she never offered more than that. In the letter, my grandfather never named the man, not once. He called him unsuitable. He called him ambitious beyond his station. He called him persuasive in the way weaker women often mistake for devotion. Even then, with the paper in my hand, I could hear Samuel Carter protecting his own judgment beneath all that condemnation. Men like my grandfather rarely write letters to confess. They write to preserve their version of events. That much I knew before I reached the second page. Whatever truth he had left behind, it was not mercy that guided his pen. It was control. Even from the grave, he intended to decide how this story entered me. He wrote that the man had come from a respectable local family, educated, articulate, and already spoken for in ways that mattered more than affection. There were obligations attached to his name, a father with business holdings, a mother with social standing, a future already arranged in rooms where my mother was never meant to stand. That narrowed the world considerably. Richmond was not so large then, and black families with means moved through the same churches, the same schools, the same summer socials with all the same guarded expectations. Respectability had neighborhoods, it had gatekeepers, it had women who smiled with their mouths and measured bloodlines with their eyes. My mother, for all her poise, had not come from money. My grandfather had discipline, influence, and a stern kind of dignity, but not the kind of wealth that turned mistakes into manageable inconvenience. A daughter with a hidden pregnancy was not a private sorrow in those circles. It was a threat to standing. That, more than heartbreak, was what the letter kept circling. Not my mother's grief, not her fear, not her loneliness. Reputation, appearances, containment. Samuel wrote of discretion the way Scripture speaks of salvation. He seemed less concerned with what had happened to Ruth than with who might one day say it aloud in public. And yet, for all his certainty, he left fractures in the telling. He wrote that the man refused marriage. Then 2 lines later he wrote that marriage had never been possible. Those are not the same thing. One is refusal, the other is design. I read that difference and felt the first clean edge of suspicion. If the man had simply abandoned her, my grandfather would have written him as coward and left it there. But he did not. He lingered too carefully over lineage, alliances, obligations, and what could not be disturbed. He was not describing romance gone wrong. He was describing a hierarchy closing ranks around one of its sons. That was when I thought of Charles Whittemore. I had not said his name in years, but it rose in me all at once. Judge Charles Whittemore by the time I knew him, family friend, Sunday guest, the man who brought my mother oranges in winter and kissed her hand too long for courtesy. He was older when I knew him, broad-shouldered and polished, with silver at his temples, and the kind of voice people lower theirs around. He had known my grandfather since boyhood. He sat at our table enough to feel ordinary, too ordinary, perhaps. My mother was never easy when he came to supper. She was never rude. My mother had too much discipline for visible discomfort, but she tightened in his presence. Her smile thinned, her hands grew busy. She spoke less than usual and cleared dishes before they were empty. I had taken it for old familiarity, the strain of entertaining a man accustomed to being indulged. Now, in that attic, another memory surfaced beside it. Once, when I was 14, Judge Whittemore studied my face over dessert and said to my mother, "Lorraine has your restraint, but not your eyes." The room went still enough to hear the clock in the hall. My mother set down the coffee tray too carefully. At 14, I had not understood the silence that followed. I only knew my mother answered too quickly, and my grandfather changed the subject with a force so smooth it passed for grace. Thomas Bennet kept eating peach cobbler with his eyes lowered to his plate, as though the safest place in that room was beneath notice. I remembered that dinner now with such clarity it unsettled me. Judge Whittemore had smiled after making that remark, not apologetic, not careless, but measuring. My mother replied that children gather themselves from many corners, and my grandfather laughed one beat too late. It had sounded harmless then. In the attic, it sounded like warning. The letter did not name Charles Whittemore,
But once his face entered my mind, the page began bending toward him. Respectable family, educated, spoken for, protected by obligations larger than affection, that fit him too well for comfort. So did the old unease in my mother's shoulders whenever his car pulled into our drive. I kept reading, slower now, because certainty can be as dangerous as ignorance when grief is doing the interpreting. Samuel wrote that the man's mother had intervened directly and made clear no alliance with Ruth would be entertained under any condition. The child, he said, would not be acknowledged. The matter would be resolved discreetly. I knew enough women to hear another woman's cruelty in that sentence. Not loud, not vulgar, just precise enough to leave no room for appeal. I imagined my mother at 19, carrying me under her dress while some polished matriarch explained in careful language exactly how disposable a young woman becomes when she threatens inheritance. Samuel wrote that he had considered legal remedies and was advised against them. Advised by whom, he did not say. He claimed there was no profit in public scandal and no justice likely to survive the expense of pursuit. Again, the language told on him. He had not lost to morality, he had lost to power. That mattered more than I expected. My grandfather had ruled our family by certainty. To imagine him outmatched unsettled something old in me. It explained his severity in ways I had never permitted myself to consider. A man humiliated in one room will often spend decades restoring his authority in smaller ones. Children make convenient territory. I do not say that to absolve him. Age has taught me explanation and forgiveness are not the same labor. But truth does ask for proportion. Samuel Carter was not simply stern, he was a man who had once discovered the limits of his power and spent the rest of his life disguising that wound as order. The second page grew more intimate after that, though not kinder. He wrote that my mother had insisted on keeping one thing for herself. She would not name the father, not to me, not ever, and not because she wished to protect him, because she refused, in Samuel's words, to let that family lay claim twice. I read that sentence over and over. Not let that family lay claim twice. There was more in it than defiance. There was strategy. My mother had lost the right to marry whom she chose, to tell her story plainly, to carry her pregnancy without negotiation, but she had kept one final authority, access. That changed her silence for me. All my life I had understood it as fear, perhaps shame, perhaps emotional thrift mistaken for strength, but there in that attic I saw another possibility. Silence had been the last property she owned outright. She had withheld the truth not only from me, she had withheld me from them. It did not make the lie gentler, it did not soften the years of confusion or explain the careful distance she kept, even in love, but it did make her less passive than I had imagined. She had not merely endured arrangement, she had edited it where she could. Some women survive by refusals so quiet it resembles surrender. I thought then of every time Charles Whitmore had brought gifts to our house he had no reason to bring. Books when I was small, fountain pens when I was older, a dictionary with my initials embossed in gold when I graduated. Always generous, always measured, never intimate enough to invite objection, never distant enough to disappear. He had paid attention in ways I once mistaken for courtesy. He remembered what I read, asked after my grades, sent a note when I was accepted to Hampton. My grandfather called it mentorship. My mother called it kindness, with such dryness I should have heard the warning then. I did not. I was young and wanted approval. Children are not foolish. They are simply loyal to the explanations that let home remain intact. I accepted every oddness offered to me in language that preserved the floor beneath my feet. Judge Whitmore was a family friend. My father was reserved. My mother was private. My grandfather was strict. I called the arrangement ordinary and lived inside it. Then I found the final paragraph on the second page, and ordinary gave way for good. Samuel wrote that should I ever seek confirmation after his death, I was to look not to Ruth, who had earned her silence, but to the enclosed records he prayed I would have the wisdom never to examine. There were no records in the envelope, no enclosure, just the letter and a crease where something else had once been folded inside. I checked the trunk again, then the floor, then between the other pages with hands no longer steady. Nothing. Whatever proof he had left had been removed before I ever climbed those stairs. That was the moment the room changed. A letter can wound. Missing evidence can accuse. Somebody besides my grandfather had seen this before me. Somebody had opened that envelope, taken what confirmed the truth, left the confession, and placed it all back in cedar to be found late enough to do the least public damage.
I sat with that realization until my legs went numb beneath me. The missing papers unsettled me more than the letter had. Lies told long ago belonged to the dead in one way. Interference belongs to the living. Somebody had found this before I did, made a choice inside it, and then closed the trunk again. There were only so many people who had access to that attic after my mother passed. Me, of course, my husband before he died, my sister Evelyn, my brother James, and Evelyn's daughter Denise, who helped sort clothes after the funeral and never met a drawer she did not think entitled to explanation. I began there, not because I distrusted Denise most, because she had always mistaken curiosity for pathology. She was 50 by then, efficient, sharp, and raised on the modern belief that every silence is pathology and every boundary an invitation to excavate. She loved us, I do believe that, but love in younger hands can arrive wearing appetite. I folded the letter back into its envelope and carried it downstairs with a care usually reserved for ashes. I made tea, though I did not drink it. Then I called Evelyn. My sister answered on the fourth ring in the same voice she had used for 40 years, warm enough to sound open, measured enough to reveal nothing. I asked her one simple question. Had she ever gone through Mother's cedar trunk after the funeral? There was a pause long enough to become its own answer. Then she said, I looked through some things, just to sort. Her tone stayed light, too light. I asked if she had found letters. Another pause. Then she asked, which letters? That was Evelyn's oldest habit. Never deny first, clarify, buy time, let the other person show their cards before you show your own. She had been doing it since girlhood and she was elegant at it. I told her I had found one addressed to Mother and that something had been removed from it. Silence met me then, clean and unadorned. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. I had her exhale before she spoke. Lorraine, she said, some things were left buried because they needed to stay that way. I remember looking at the steam rising from my untouched tea and feeling a small cold piece of my patience set itself down. I asked her what she had taken. She did not answer that directly either. She said she had found the letter years ago while helping me sort Mother's things. She said she read it because she thought it concerned property. That was insult added to offense, and we both knew it. Evelyn had never mistaken family secrets for paperwork. She told me the missing papers were copies of 2 birth records and a note in our mother's hand. She removed them because, in her words, there was no good to come from reopening what had already cost enough. She said it as though she had done me a kindness. That was the wound beneath the wound. People speak often of betrayal as if it arrives through enemies. It rarely does. More often, it comes dressed as stewardship. Someone decides what you can bear. Someone edits your life in the name of preserving it. Then years pass, and what they call protection settles into your bones as absence with no visible source. I asked her where the papers were now. She said locked away. I asked how long she had known. Another pause. Then she told me she had known since our mother's funeral. 12 years. 12 years she had sat across from me at Thanksgiving, brought pound cake to my table, asked after my blood pressure, and kept my own history in a drawer. I should tell you, I shouted. It would make the scene easier to understand, but anger at our age grows quieter, not louder. I asked her why she believed she had the right. She said because I was the one most likely to let the truth ruin what little peace our mother had managed to leave behind. That answer told me more than the letter had. Evelyn had not hidden it for mother. She had hidden it for order, for continuity, for the old religion of appearances dressed in modern language. My sister had inherited our grandfather's instinct more faithfully than any of us. She simply wore it with softer lipstick and better manners. I told her I wanted the papers. She said she would think on it. I said, no, you already had 12 years to think. I want them brought to my house tonight. Another silence. Then she asked very quietly, what if knowing changes nothing useful? I told her useful was never the measure. True was. She arrived after 7, carrying a leather document case she held too tightly for a casual visit. She looked composed in the way women do when they have rehearsed themselves in the mirror. Pearl earrings, pressed slacks, a face arranged to imply reason. I let her in, took the case from her hand, and did not offer supper. She sat at my kitchen table while I opened it. Inside were the copies she had named, a folded note, and a photograph I had never seen. Before I read a word, I looked at the picture. My mother, young and unsmiling, standing beside Charles Whitmore beneath summer trees. His hand rested at her back like possession.
The photograph was small, square at the edges, the kind taken by somebody close enough to be trusted. My mother could not have been more than 19. Her dress was plain, light-colored, fitted at the waist. Charles Whitmore stood beside her in shirt sleeves, one hand at her back, his expression calm with the confidence of a man unaccustomed to consequence. What held me was not his hand, it was hers. She was not touching him, not leaning in, not performing sweetness for the camera. She stood straight, chin lifted slightly, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the lens. Even then, she looked composed in that familiar way of hers, but now I recognized something underneath it, refusal already taking shape. I set the photograph down and opened the first document. It was a copy of my original birth certificate, issued in August 1948. My name appeared there plain enough, Lorraine Alice Carter. Not Bennett, Carter. My mother listed as Ruth Elaine Carter, father's name left blank. No fiction yet, just omission, official and deliberate. The second document was the amended certificate filed in 1955, the year my mother married Thomas Bennett. My surname changed, my father's line completed. Thomas Edward Bennett, inserted clean where blank had once stood, as if a man could be written into blood by clerk's ink and enough mutual agreement. I stared at the paper longer than I meant to. Thomas had married my mother when I was 7, not as an infant. That truth landed slower and harder. Samuel's letter had bent chronology to suit his dignity. Thomas had not arrived at my beginning. He had arrived later and allowed himself to be written backward into it, not simply solution, revision. The difference mattered more than I liked. I looked up at Evelyn. She had folded her hands in front of her, like a woman wading through weather she expected. I asked why I remembered no wedding before 7. She said because there was no wedding worth remembering. Courthouse, 2 witnesses, me left with neighbors until evening. She said it gently, which made it no less cruel. Everything in me began rearranging itself around that age, 7, old enough to remember, old enough to have loved another version of the world first. I searched my mind with sudden urgency and found what had always been there, buried beneath better stories. A different apartment, smaller rooms, my mother sewing late, no man in the house. Memory came back in fragments, then with force. A grim tiled kitchen, a narrow iron bed in my room, my mother crying once behind a locked bathroom door while I sat in the hallway with my knees to my chest. A man visiting on Sundays sometimes, not Charles, Thomas, careful, polite, carrying oranges in a paper sack. He had not been my father then. He had been a suitor, or perhaps something negotiated and tested before being agreed upon. I remembered calling him Mr. Bennet at first. I remember the day he corrected me gently, saying, "You can call me Thomas until you decide what else fits." That memory nearly undid me where anger had not. Some grief arrives not for what was done, but for what was attempted. Thomas had not lied first. He had entered slowly, with more honesty than anyone around him. Whatever arrangement brought us near, he had at least allowed room for my consent, small and childish though it was. I had not expected tenderness to survive this. I turned then to my mother's note. It was written on thin stationery, folded twice, the handwriting tighter than in the recipes and church lists I knew. Only 6 lines. Ruth had written to Samuel after he drafted his letter, and the paper shook in my hand before I had read even the first sentence. If Lorraine ever learns enough to ask, she deserves what is true, not what protects pride. Thomas has been kinder than any of us had a right to ask. Do not punish him by calling sacrifice what was, in the end, decency. Charles is her father by blood. Thomas is the only man who chose her. I stopped there and pressed my fingers against my mouth. There are sentences that do not break you. They simply remove the scaffolding you had mistaken for bone. Thomas is the only man who chose her. In one line, my mother had redrawn every room I had grown up in and named the mercy I had overlooked. Evelyn said nothing while I finished reading. She did not need to. The note had already done what her explanations never could. It stripped nobility from secrecy and left only motives standing bare. Samuel had preserved reputation. Evelyn had preserved structure. My mother had preserved agency where she could. Thomas, of all of them, had preserved me. I thought of every quiet kindness I had misread as detachment, every school recital he attended without fanfare, every broken hinge repaired before I noticed it sagging, the way he never raised his voice in a house full of people who mistook control for strength. I had called him emotionally absent because he was not possessive. When I finally looked at Evelyn, she was watching me with something like caution, perhaps even pity. She said she removed the note because she knew that line would change how I remembered him. I told her she was right. Then I told her that was precisely why it was never hers to take.
Evelyn stayed another hour, long enough for the evening to settle and the kitchen to darken around us. We did not raise our voices. At our age, the deepest arguments are rarely loud. They move slower than anger and cut cleaner. My sister sat across from me with our mother's posture and our grandfather's instincts, and for once she did not hide either. She said she had removed the note because she knew I would love Thomas differently once I read it, and she believed the dead should be allowed to keep the shape in which grief has settled them. I told her grief was not china. It did not crack from handling. It calcified from avoidance. She said some truths arrive too late to heal anything. I told her healing had never been my demand. Accuracy was. There is a peculiar violence in being managed by people who call themselves merciful. They do not strike. They arrange. They revise. They remove evidence and call the emptiness peace. I had lived long enough inside that architecture. Evelyn looked tired then,
not defensive exactly, but worn in a place appearances cannot cover. She said she had spent her whole life keeping this family from splintering under truths none of us were built to carry well. I told her perhaps we had splintered anyway and simply learned to call the cracks inheritance. That landed where it needed to. My sister went quiet in the old way, gaze lowered, jaw set, sorting through responses she could no longer use. Then she said something I had not expected. She said she was not protecting me when she took the papers. She was protecting herself from what knowing would require. That, at least, was honest. Evelyn had loved our grandfather best because certainty suited her. He gave the world hard edges and named them order. To admit he had bartered our mother's life around reputation, then curated the lie for decades, would require my sister to reconsider the architecture of her own obedience. Few people do that willingly. She confessed she had found the papers, read them alone, and then gone home and sat in her car for an hour before going inside. She said she understood at once that Thomas had known all along and still chosen us, then half the judgments she had built her marriage on no longer held steady. There it was, not just family history, threat. Thomas Bennet's decency exposed the poverty in other men, and Evelyn had spent 50 years married to one of them. Her husband, Clarence, had provided, performed, and kept score with every kindness he ever offered. Thomas had done the work quietly, and that comparison had no mercy in it. I had never envied Evelyn's marriage, though others did. It was polished, orderly, publicly admired. Clarence opened doors, chaired committees, and spoke to my sister as though affection were a reward she could earn by staying useful. I had watched her spend decades calling that stability. Now I understood why Thomas's note was offended her more than the lie. A generous man is dangerous in families organized around transaction. He exposes the poverty everyone else agreed to call love. Thomas had done that simply by staying, by choosing me without possession, and my mother without spectacle. He made no declarations, he made no claim on sainthood, he just remained. Some people can forgive anything but unperformed goodness. By the time Evelyn left, there was nothing left to resolve between us that night, not because peace had been restored, because clarity had. She stood at my door with her handbag looped over one wrist and asked if she hated me. I told her no, hate is too intimate for what I was feeling. I told her I understood her better than I wished to, and that understanding was not absolution. Then I said the truest thing available to me. Love does not excuse theft simply because what was stolen was difficult to carry. She nodded once, the way older women do when correction has finally outrun pride. After she left, I carried the papers to my bedroom and laid them across the quilt like evidence in a trial no court would ever hear. I did not sleep much. Instead, I sat with memory and let it reorder itself around what had finally been named. That is its own kind of labor, quiet, exhausting, irreversible. Near midnight, I rose and opened the cedar box where I kept Thomas's things after he died, his watch, his union pin, a folded handkerchief, 3 letters he had written me at Hampton and signed awkwardly at first, Love, Thomas, then later, Dad, once he trusted the word enough to borrow it. I read those letters until dawn. Tuition enclosed, eat properly, call your mother, proud of your grades, tell me if the radiator in your dorm still bangs all night. Nothing grand, nothing ornamental, just a man learning how to love in verbs. By morning, I knew what had to happen next. I needed to see Charles Whitmore.
By then, Charles Whitmore was 93 and living in a brick colonial at the edge of Windsor Farms with a nurse who answered the door in white shoes and a face trained to reveal nothing. I called first. He remembered my voice at once, said my name too warmly, told me to come by after lunch. That did not surprise me. Men who have outrun consequence often mistake time for absolution. I drove across town with the papers in my handbag and Thomas's watch in my coat pocket, though I could not have said why. Perhaps I wanted one honest witness with me, even if he had been dead 2 decades. Charles received me in a sunroom full of upholstered restraint and old money made domestic, books no one had opened recently, framed photographs of descendants arranged like evidence of continuity. He had grown smaller with age, but not gentler. His face had thinned around the old confidence. His hands shook only when they were unoccupied. He smiled when he saw me, and there it was again, that studied warmth I had mistaken for kindness when I was young. He said Lorraine, as though the years between us were companionable things. He asked after my health. He asked after Evelyn. He did not ask why I had come. Men like Charles prefer revelation arrive on their timing. I sat across from him and told him plainly that I had found my mother's letter. I watched the change happen, small, exact. The smile did not vanish, but it withdrew its sincerity. His eyes sharpened. His fingers closed once around the arm of his chair. Then he asked, very quietly, which letter. That was answer enough, but I gave him none of the courtesy he had spent a lifetime mistaking for entitlement. I took out the photograph and set it on the table between us. His gaze dropped, not startled, not ashamed, familiar. He looked at the picture like a man recognizing an inconvenience he had once hoped time had buried properly. He said Ruth was a remarkable woman. That was his first defense. Not denial, tribute. Men who have failed women often become eloquent in hindsight. I let him speak. He said she was intelligent, self-possessed, too proud for her own safety. He said they were young. He said circumstances were complicated. He said it in that order. I asked if he was my father. He did not answer quickly, and for one thin second I thought he might still choose cowardice. Then he said yes. No tremor, no visible remorse, just yes, delivered with the calm of a man who had always assumed facts become harmless once enough time has passed over them. There is a strange steadiness that arrives when suspicion becomes confirmation. I did not feel shock then, only precision. I asked if he had known my whole life. He said yes again. He said he had followed my schooling, quietly assisted where he could, and tried in his way to ensure opportunities reached me. There it was, patronage offered in place of fatherhood. I asked whether the books, the tuition donation to Hampton, the clerkship recommendation after college had come through him. He inclined his head once, almost relieved to be recognized inside his own design. Not love, access, influence distributed at safe distance and mistaken for care. I asked him why he had never spoken. He gave me the answer men like him have used for generations when cowardice has had enough time to learn grammar. He said public acknowledgment would have damaged too many lives. His wife, his sons, my mother's standing, my future. He said silence had protected everyone concerned. I told him silence had protected him. For the first time, something in his expression hardened, not anger, irritation, the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to hearing his self-regard translated accurately. He said I was being unfair to the era. I told him eras do not make decisions, people do. He looked away then, toward the winter garden beyond the glass, and said my mother had refused every private arrangement he offered after I was born. Money, a house, schooling, discretion with provision. She refused it all unless it came with public acknowledgment. When he would not give it, she closed the door. That sounded like her, so much so that I nearly smiled. I asked whether he had loved her. He took too long to answer, long enough to reveal the truth before he spoke it. He said he had admired her deeply and regretted the pain caused. Admiration, regret, fine words for a man who kept his own name clean. Then I asked the only question that still mattered. I asked whether Thomas Bennet knew exactly whose place he was being asked to occupy. He looked at me for a long moment, then said yes, Thomas knew. He also knew, Charles added, that decency is sometimes the only form of courage left for ordinary men. I left his house without shaking his hand, not from anger alone, but because there was nothing left to exchange. He had given me confirmation and kept his posture. That was his way. I stepped back into the afternoon with a clarity that felt less like relief and more like air after a long-held breath. On the drive home, the city looked the same and not the same. Familiar streets, familiar trees, the same houses that had always carried more history than they admitted. But now I understood something about inheritance I had never named before. It is not only what is passed down, it is also what is withheld. I thought about my mother at 19, standing in rooms where decisions about her life were made without her consent, and still choosing where she could to draw a line. I thought about Thomas, walking into a situation that offered him respectability in exchange for silence, and choosing instead to build something quiet and durable inside it. And I thought about Charles, who had never lacked for options and had chosen preservation over courage, then spent a lifetime mistaking controlled generosity for redemption. There was no need to hate him. His life had already revealed its limits. Some men gather everything and still remain smaller than the choices they avoided. By the time I reached my house, the weight of what I had learned had settled into something steadier. Not peace, not yet, but a kind of alignment. The past had not changed, only my position within it had. That is enough to shift a life, even late in the telling. I went inside and set the papers back on my table. For a long time I stood there without sitting, looking at the 2 certificates, the photograph, my mother's note. 4 objects, 4 versions of truth arranged side by side. It struck me then how easily a life can be divided by paper. I did not call Evelyn that evening. There was nothing left to argue. Understanding had replaced it, and understanding does not require an audience. She had done what she believed necessary. I had done what was required to correct it. Some relationships continue after that. Others simply change their terms and proceed. That night, I took Thomas's letters from the cedar box again and read them once more, not searching for what I had missed, but honoring what had always been there. There is a difference between discovery and recognition. Discovery startles, recognition steadies. I was past the first and settling into the second. I realized then that the man who raised me had never been confused about his place. He entered it with full knowledge, without illusion, and without demand for gratitude. He did not compete with absence. He did not attempt to rewrite origin. He simply showed up again and again until presence became its own truth. There are men who insist on being named. Thomas never did. And because of that, I had spent years underestimating him. That is the quiet injustice of certain kinds of goodness.
It does not announce itself, so it is often mistaken for luck. I had called him distant when he had been careful not to claim what was not his. Sitting there, I understood that identity is not settled by blood alone. Blood begins a story, it does not complete it. The shape of a life is carved by who stays, who leaves, who speaks, and who remains when speaking would be easier than staying. In that measure, Thomas had been my father long before any document agreed. I slept more soundly that night than I had the one before, not because the truth was gentle, but because it had stopped shifting beneath me. Morning came without urgency. I rose, made coffee, and opened the window over the sink the way I had done for years. The house did not feel different. I did. Before noon, I gathered the papers, placed them in a new envelope, and wrote a single name on the front. Not Carter, not Whitmore, Bennett. I set it in the drawer beside Thomas's watch and closed it with the quiet certainty of a decision that would not require revisiting. Some things, once seen clearly, do not require further debate. I did not know then whether I would ever tell anyone else. That question felt less important than it once might have. Truth does not always demand announcement. Sometimes it asks only to be held without distortion. I had spent 72 years inside a version of my story arranged by other hands. That arrangement had ended.
In the weeks that followed, life did what life always does. It continued without ceremony. The mail still came around noon. The church still needed volunteers for repast dinners. My knees still complained in the rain. Revelation has a way of sounding larger than its aftermath. Most truths do not arrive to interrupt routine. They arrive to alter what routine means. Evelyn called 3 days later and asked if I was all right. Not how I felt, not what I had decided, just whether I was all right. It was the closest my sister knew how to come to apology without surrendering posture entirely. I told her I was intact, which was true enough for where we were. She asked if I meant to tell James. I said no, not yet. My brother had spent a lifetime surviving himself by avoiding anything that required sustained emotional honesty. Some truths are not burdens because they are painful. They are burdens because they demand rearrangement, and James had built a life on not being rearranged. Evelyn said she had not slept well since bringing me the papers. I told her that was likely appropriate. She gave one short laugh, the kind that acknowledges a wound had landed where it belonged. Then she asked if I could forgive her. I said eventually, perhaps, but first I intended to remember her accurately. That was the beginning of something more honest between us, not warmer, honest. We stopped performing innocence for one another. She no longer called control concern in my presence, and I no longer called her motives generous when they were merely efficient. It was not closeness, but it was cleaner than what came before, and cleaner has its uses. I went to Thomas's grave the following Sunday after church, not out of guilt, out of proportion. His stone sits beneath a maple on the older side of Cedar Hill, modest and plain the way he would have preferred. I brought no flowers. He had always mistrusted gestures that bloom briefly and ask to be admired for trying. I stood there a long while with my gloves in one hand and told him what I had learnt, though I suspect he had never required the telling. I thanked him, which felt insufficient and late, but true. Then I said the word I had been too careful with when he was alive, Father. No thunder answered, no revelation descended, just wind through bare branches and the ordinary hush of cemetery ground. But something in me settled when I said it aloud. not because language changes the dead, because sometimes it finally places the living where they belonged. I never returned to Charles Whitmore's house. There was no purpose in it. He died 8 months later, praised in print for his civic service, his legal mind, his devotion to family. I read the obituary over coffee and felt no anger rise. Public memory had done what it always does. It polished what could be displayed. I folded the paper, set it aside, and went on with my mourning. That was not forgiveness, it was proportion. He had spent his life protected by the usefulness of his image. I had no interest in contesting it for strangers. My correction was not for the public record, it was for the private one that had shaped me. As for my mother, she grew larger in truth than she had ever seemed in life. Not softer, not easier, but larger. I stopped asking why she had loved me in such careful portions and began understanding how much of her had been spent securing the right to love me at all without surrendering me to those people. Age does not make the past simpler. It makes its patterns easier to see. My family was not built on one lie, it was built on many accommodations, some cruel, some necessary, some made in fear, some made in love, and some made so quietly they passed for character instead of survival. That is what the letter gave me in the end, not scandal, not vindication, scale. It taught me that blood can explain a beginning and still fail every test that matters after. It taught me that silence can be cowardice but also strategy, that dignity is not always honesty, and that love, when it is real, often arrives without possession. I was 72 when I climbed into the attic looking for winter curtains and found the architecture of my life folded inside an envelope. I came down with more than family history. I came down with a better measure of what makes kin, what makes father, and what deserves to be carried forward. Now when people ask where I come from, I tell them Richmond, Virginia, and leave the rest alone unless truth is required. Most days it is not. Most days it is enough to know this. The man whose blood made me was never the measure of me. The man who chose me was.